Yeah, thank you very much, Amy, for the presentation, and good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see so many people here to hear this talk about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The presentation will deal with two papers that I've written. One has been already published and touches upon the energy sector strategy of the bank, and in particular the European engagement, the European countries' engagement with the energy sector strategy. And the second one will deal with an analysis of the operations of the projects approved by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So just to give you a little bit of context, the AIIB was first announced, introduced by Xi Jinping in a speech in front of the Indonesian parliament, where he stated that China is committed to greater connectivity with Asian countries. And the main purpose of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank would have been that create greater connectivities and give priority to Asian countries' needs. In 2013, it was still a little bit unclear what kind of initiative the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank would have been. It was really a mysterious kind of initiative, and at first, that is probably why it was perceived as a direct challenge to the US Federal Order, but also to the World Bank and to the Asian Development Bank to some extent. It was believed that it would undermine or impact negatively the international development finance regime and the standards and norms, in particular regarding environmental and social standards that are applied to development projects. It was also associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, also because those two initiatives were announced in the same period of time. It was thought that the AIIB would have been the lending arm of the Belt and Road Initiative. It would mainly finance projects related to the Belt and Road Initiative, but with the starting of its operation and its early phase has come to not be completely true. So the AIIB doesn't only finance projects related to the Belt and Road Initiative. And during the years, the AIIB has also sought to increase its legitimacy by applying high social environmental standards and aligning with the previous agreements negotiated between countries. For example, we will talk about the Paris Agreement regarding climate change. So just to give you a little bit of a picture of who were the initial countries that adhered to this initiative. Those are the founding members of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, most of them, of course, in Asia, since the bank was supposed to have a regional focus. But you also have European countries, not all of them. Italy, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Portugal, and the Scandinavian countries were the main countries that adhered to the bank from its early operations. But then in Africa, you also have Egypt and Ethiopia. So while those are the founding members of the AIIB, the membership has expanded greatly over the years. As you can see, the focus is not on Asia anymore. You have countries from all of the continents. They first expanded from darker colors to lighter colors. They expanded firstly in Europe, so Spain, Ireland, Belgium, Belarus, Hungary, and also Canada. But then it also expanded in Latin America or Southern America, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Peru, Ecuador. And more recently, it also expanded to Africa, both North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, and even more recently, it's not shown in this map maybe, but also Senegal in 2025, so they just accessed. So it is currently the second largest multilateral development bank in terms of membership. In terms of operation, the operational are also expanded. We will see that later. But to argue that the AIIB is still a regional development bank, it is quite difficult because of the size of the membership and because of the size of the operation. So it resembles a little bit more a multilateral development bank with not anymore having a regional focus. What are the countries that are missing and that are the most obvious? Two countries that had been invited to join but decided not to, Japan and the United States. They decided not to join. The United States also actively tried to prevent the accession of the European countries to this new Chinese initiative at first during the Obama administration. And while there were some discussions in Japan about accessing the bank after its initial years, they still haven't done so. But those are for sure the two big countries that are missing within the membership of the bank. So one of the questions that I asked myself, well, not only me, I built it on some works that have already been published, was why did the European countries decided to join the AIIB as founding members? So it's also a question that I asked myself after that I read this statement by the first president of the Asian Investment Bank, Kim Il-kyun, in 2019 at the Board of Governors meeting, which for the first time was held outside of Asia and in Europe, in Luxembourg, in 2019. He said European shareholders have prodigiously contributed to the creation of this new multilateral development bank, and as a result, the AIIB holds distinctively European characteristics. So the first thing that came to my mind was the question, is it so? And if so, how did they contribute to the bank, try to influence it? What are the characteristics that we can see within the AIIB that the European members were interested about? And so I wrote this paper that has been published in Global Policy, titled Shaping Sustainable Finance, European Engagement with the Other Infrastructure Investment Banks, Energy Strategy. So while in this paper I do not argue that it is only the European influence that led to the AIIB having more European characteristics, as Jim was saying, or that the European countries only with their influence managed to shape the direction of the bank, I would say that, and I will try to show you that it is one of the factors that was at play during the initial operation, the early phase of the bank. So what had already been established, previous studies that have examined the European membership within the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank had found three main motivations that emerged and explained why the European countries decided to join. So the first one was to enhance bilateral relations with China. And in this case, we have to remember that those events were happening in 2014, 2015. So at that moment in time, China wasn't still considered as a strategic rival by European countries and by the European Union. And so there was the actual need for the European countries to engage more both diplomatically and economically with China. The second reason was to obtain formal influence within the AIIB and voting power within the bank, which actually consists or goes up to 23% of the total voting power within the bank. And the third reason was to preserve the rules-based governance system through their informal influence. So what kind of influence can states in international organizations, and specifically European countries, have on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? We can argue that there are two main kinds of influence and mechanisms, so formal and informal influence. And those formal mechanisms actually refer to one of the reasons why the European countries decided to join, which was increase their voting power. But of course, in other cases, countries could have veto power or veto authority over some issues within international organizations, as it is the case, for example, of China within the AIIB, who has a veto power on certain decisions taken by the bank. And also the participation in internal committees, but also participation in particular board of directors meetings or constituencies. On the other hand, what I was mostly interested about was the informal governance and the informal influence that countries could have, defined as the systematic influence of unwritten rules, shared expectations or norms within international organizations. And with that in mind, there were already some articles, some works on the influence that European power or the European Union can have, the informal influence that they can have. Manners described it as normative power Europe, so the ability of both the European Union or its member states to influence treaties and decisions of third parties and to shape the perception of what can be. Forsberg it identifies four key mechanisms through which this influence is actually exerted, and those are the through persuasion, the invocation of norms, discourse shaping, and leading by example. The invocation of norms, and in particular in this case of the Paris Agreement and the alignment with the Paris Agreement, were really central and used very often by European countries, but also discourse shaping and keeping the spotlight on certain topics, and in this case, environmental governance and climate change, were also used by European countries in this context. In my paper, I used a qualitative discourse analysis, so trying to analyze, identify recurring themes in primary documents of the bank, including minutes of the board of directors, annual meetings of the board of governors, annual reports of the AIIB, as well as looking at the strategic documents that emerged from the negotiation that were held at the board of governors meeting. So, for example, the energy sector strategy, which is updated every 5 years. In the case of the AIIB, the corporate strategy, which was approved in 2020 and it is negotiated every 10 years, but also the environmental and social frameworks that were adopted by the bank. And while it is very hard to open the black box of the decision-making within the bank, the statements of the country at the Board of Governors meeting, I would say that it is the only way to actually see the preferences of those countries, not only the European ones, but of all the countries that have the possibility or want to make a statement during those occasions. And it is also a source of data which I hadn't seen before used in the case of the AIIB. So I thought that it could be interesting to look at those. So there are two main governing bodies. I already presented them a little bit, but let's go delve deeper into them. The Board of Governors and the Board of Directors. They are very similar to other multilateral development banks, so it is not a unicum of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But the Board of Governors consists of a governor for each country or each member state. They supervise the work of the president and the Board of Directors. They set the general strategy and the general line that the bank should follow for the next years. On the other hand, the Board of Directors is smaller in size. In the case of the AIIB, it has 12 directors in it, which are elected by the 12 constituencies of the country, which we will see in a moment. They cover a little bit more the day-to-day operations. They approve the budgets, they approve the projects and operations of the bank. They establish policies. They prepare the strategic documents that are then negotiated and approved by the Board of Governors. So in terms of voting power, as I was saying, the European countries have a total of 23%. I grouped it together. I chose to talk about European countries rather than European Union countries, because first of all, they are grouped into two constituencies. We will see them. And also the AIIB treats them as quite a cohesive group of countries. The main countries in terms of voting power are Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, and then Spain. And as a comparison, you can see here that China alone has more voting power than all of the European countries together. So 26.3% of the total voting power. It has a bit of power over some decisions of the bank, because there are some decisions that needs to be taken at the 75% level of voting power. Initially, China proposed to lower. It has lowered this share since 2014, since the setup of the bank. They would have given up they said that they would have given up the veto power if Japan and the US would agree to join the bank. Australia, on the other hand, I also added the figure for Australia, is at 3.41% of the total voting power, I thought. This figure would have been higher, also considering that Germany alone has more power than Australia has. As I was saying, these countries are split and grouped into constituencies, which is something that is not, again, a unicum of the AIIB. The same also happens at the World Bank or the ADB. In the case of the AIIB, we have constituency 8, which is also named the wider European constituency, where you can find a group of countries that did not adopt the euro as their currencies. Some of them, those in bold, are also members of the European Union. And there is this outlier that is the United Kingdom, which up to a certain moment was a member of the European Union, and then they left. So the reason why I decided to talk about European countries and not European Union members was also because it was a little bit tricky to understand the position of the United Kingdom, which is not a European Union country anymore, but also because since they are grouped in those constituencies, they already negotiate and collaborate and cooperate at the constituency level to have a common position at the board of directors or at the board of governors. So there is some cooperation already among those countries, and so there is some cooperation at the European level. The second constituency is the Euro area constituency, all countries that adopted the euro or countries that are members of the European Union. As a comparison, again, you have constituency 5, which is composed of China and Hong Kong, China, which is the official name of Hong Kong at the AIIB. So constituency 5 is mainly controlled by China. And then you have constituency 7, which is composed of Australia, Cook Islands, Nauru, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Singapore, and Vietnam. And as of today, at the moment, the director from constituency 7 is from New Zealand, so it has been elected by New Zealand, and the alternate, I think, is Australia, but constituency 7 is mainly controlled by Australia and New Zealand, so those are the two main countries within the constituency. So why the energy sector strategy? Why focusing on a specific sector and analyze what the European countries or also all the other members of the bank say about the energy sector strategy? It is because most of the discussion and the negotiations have been focused on this topic since 2014, 2015, since the bank entered into operations. That is because the questions remain, the question that I was arguing before and that was scrutinized deeply by different authors of how much the AIIB would align with environmental and social standards and uphold high environmental and social standards approved also by other bilateral development banks. And the third reason will be because most of the operations of the AIIB are in the energy sector. More than 50% we will see of the operations of the bank specifically tailored the energy sector. So I split my analysis into 3 different periods, from 2016 to 2018, from 2019 to 2021, and from 2022 to 2023. And the main reason is because the negotiations regarding the energy sector are cyclical, meaning that they are intensified when there is a period when a strategic document needs to be negotiated, and then they decrease when that specific document has been approved. In the case of the first period of analysis in 2017, it was a real focal moment because the first energy sector strategy of the bank was being negotiated and approved. In 2020, the corporate strategy was being negotiated, which had a lot of elements related to the energy sector of the bank. And then in 2022, there was the first revision of the energy sector strategy, which is revised every 5 years, so from 2017 to 2020. So during the first period of analysis, as I was saying, the first energy sector strategy was approved. One of the key takeaways of the energy sector strategy was that there are ample opportunities for investments in oil and gas extraction as clients seek to improve the security of their energy supply. So here, analyzing the energy sector strategy document, I saw 2 main focuses. One on the client side, so on developing countries and their needs, and the second one on security, which is a theme that will come back later more importantly in 2022. But of course, European countries were not really happy about the decision taken related to the energy sector strategy, which apart from oil and gas extraction and investments, also still gave the possibility of investments in coal, which the AIIB never really did investments in coal, but there were some projects that were related to power plants that still used coal as their energy mix. And of course, one of the reasons that could be argued for the use of those fossil fuels in Asia is because most of the Asian countries still heavily rely on those fossil fuels, but also on coal. If you think about China, China is at the forefront for investments in renewable energies, but its energy mix is still relying on coal. For European countries, more European countries, but these four all use this same exact sentence in their statements during the Board of Governors meeting. And I thought it was really showing that there is at least some cooperation, that they coordinate at the internal level, at the European level, and with very similar wording, they all express the same preoccupation and the same position of trying to focus more on renewable energies rather than on fossil fuels. So in this period, the influence of the European countries was not very influential, was not very there in terms of how the negotiations went. They did try to improve their influence and to leverage a common positions in the years after, in 2020, where there were the negotiations related to the corporate strategy. And at that moment in time, they all had a very specific agreement in their minds, which was the Paris Climate Agreement. All of them tried to push the bank to align and to expressively say that they would align with the Paris Climate Agreement in their corporate strategy. You will see the United Kingdom makes explicit reference to the Paris Climate Agreement. Spain, France implementing the Paris Agreement. Germany recalls the Paris Agreement as well. And that was one of the mechanisms that we had seen before, that the European countries and the European Union member states usually use when they want to influence some agreements or negotiations. So the invocation of norms or agreements, and in this case, the Paris Agreement. Not only this is just a group of them, but all of the European countries recall the Paris Agreement, and they also did in the case of constituency statements. So one single constituency can also make a constituency statement or a group statement. And in this case, the Water European constituency clearly stated that they would have liked to see an alignment with the Paris Agreement in the corporate strategy. Of course, it was not only the European countries that argued in favor of this alignment. You have also, for example, Australia, which at the same moment in time argued in favor of an alignment with the Paris Agreement as well. There are few other countries that had the same position. Australia, New Zealand, and probably Canada are the only three, apart from the European countries, that had such a strong opinion related to this agreement. While in the case of the European countries, we can see that there is an actual cooperation, and they clearly coordinated on a common front and a common position. It is likely that it is the same for Australia, that they also coordinated in terms of European and other developed countries, but it is less evident. And while it has been confirmed to be in some interviews that the European countries actually have a common position and coordinate beforehand, I still wouldn't say the same about Australia. So what were the outcomes of these influence or these opinions regarding the Paris Agreement? The European countries has to increase the share of renewable energies and climate investments. And in 2020, the corporate strategy actually set a very important objective, which was a little bit in opposition to what had been said before in the energy sector strategy. And the objective was to reach or surpassing by 2025 at least a 50% share of climate finance in its actual financing approvals, which the AIIB did. Even before 2025, they reached at least 50% of climate investments. And then in 2021, the president of the AIIB announced that the bank would align with the goals of the Paris Agreements by July 1st of 2023. The bank had already was not yet officially aligned with the Paris Agreement, but they had already had some discussions about it. But officially in 2021 was the moment when it was announced the alignment with the Paris Agreement, which was also done in a joint statement with other multilateral development banks, including the World Bank, the AIIB, the new development bank. So many banks at the same moment in time decided to align with the Paris Agreement. Then in 2022, 2023, there were economic crises and some other crises like the COVID-19 pandemic and the energy crisis generated by the invasion of Ukraine, which had an important effect, of course, not only at the negotiation of the AIIB, but on the world in general. But there was a need expressed by many developing countries, and this is a case in point. The Egypt is a case in point within the AIIB because they make a lot of statements. They are really engaged with the bank. There was a renewed interest in the increase of fuels as a source of energy, proving the fact and need to diversify sources of renewable energy. And those needs and that position was leveraged because there was the need to have an energy security by those countries. So clearly the crisis led to a little bit of a move back that the bank and the negotiation took from a move towards the renewable energy and back to fossil fuels again. This is the European countries at a completely different position and argumentation. And they asked to exclude explicitly investments in coal, oil, as well as upstream and midstream gas from the energy sector strategy that was going to be revised in 2022. As of today, the energy sector strategy still allows for investments in oil and gas. I think they excluded coal at some point in time, or at least the president of the bank said that they wouldn't allow investments in coal anymore. So while those were the negotiations and the general line regarding the policies implemented by the bank, I also wanted to check and analyze the investments made, whether they could tell us something more about how the AIIB operates. So a second paper that I wrote, and still not yet been published, but it's under review, assesses the operations of the AIIB. And the reason why the main reason why I decided to write that paper was because there is already evidence of the United States having some influence over other international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. So, for example, the World Bank or the AIIB, and there is already some evidence that relates some influence of the US towards how these operations are taking place at the World Bank. And specifically, that influence extends not only to formal influence, but also to informal influence, including the ability to sway the voters and manipulate the management of those organizations. So my question was, is something similar happening at the AIIB? And I was not the first one to ask that question because there was already some evidence on that by Kai and their colleagues. They tested the hypothesis that the operation of the AIIB were in some ways influenced by China. They analyzed 53 projects that had been approved between 2016 to 2019, and they wanted to analyze whether a closer political or economical proximity to China were factors that would have increased the likability of receiving investments or receiving more investments from the AIIB. They used a completely different methods from the one before. They now use and we will treat quantitative data, so a quantitative method. They chose a two-part model. So it is a model that works well if you want to analyze, they wanted to analyze both the selection process, so whether a country was selected more often than not to receive investments from the AIIB, but also how many resources they were allocated. So they both measured whether a country was selected more often than not and how many resources, so dollars, they received. They came to some interesting results. So, for example, there is a positive correlation between the World Bank commitments and the likability of being selected to being approved a loan from the AIIB. So the more investments you receive from the World Bank, the more likely you are to be selected for investments at the AIIB. However, regarding all the political and economical or for most of the political and economic variables, there are no statistically significant results. So there is no evidence that correlates the political and economic proximity to China to the possibility or likability of receiving more investments by the AIIB. One of the even being more indebted to China is correlated. Well, there is one statistically significant variable there. So being more indebted to China is related to a lower possibility of being selected for investments by the AIIB. Then, among the selected countries, so among the countries where the AIIB invests, they were also interested in seeing if countries that were more aligned with China used to receive more resources among all of the countries that receive resources from the AIIB. And here again, the results are similar. So there are no statistically significant variables that correlate between political proximity to China and receiving more funds from the AIIB. I think the variable related to trade is interesting. So the more you trade with China, the less funds you will receive from the AIIB if you are one of the countries receiving funds from the AIIB. So this is a very, very interesting paper that shed a lot of light on how the AIIB operates. However, I saw two main limitations of this study. The first one was the operationalization of the political proximity to China. So they really wanted to, they used a variable which relates to the behavior of states, the voting behavior of states at the United Nations General Assembly, and how much they variated from China. However, I argue in my paper that it would have been more efficient to use a variable that, the same variable, but that measured the distance from the US-led liberal court. And the second limitation was that they only analyzed 50 projects from 2016 to 2019, so it would have been more, it would have been interesting to see how the operations unfold in the next year since they approved so many more projects in the next period. So my research question is similar to the work of Kaya and the colleagues, but I wanted to analyze whether countries that are less aligned with the US-led liberal order and that are more likely not to receive financing from the mainstream multilateral development banks, so the World Bank and the AIIB, for example, because we have seen that there is some kind of influence on those banks. So some countries have an advantage and some other have a disadvantage in receiving financing and being selected for financing. And so I wanted to analyze whether those countries that are less likely to receive those financings in those institutions are more likely, on the other end, to receive fundings from the AIIB. And therefore, there were some kind of strategies like photoshopping when the states had to decide to which organization, in which organization to pursue their policy goals and which organization to choose when it came to requesting loans. So my period of analysis 2015 to 2024, I expanded the total number of projects that are observed to 2,259. So more than the previous paper. On the other hand, dependent variables and independent variables are similar. So how much investments each country receives. And the independent variables in this case, are, as I was telling you before, it is not the distance of a country from China in political terms, but the distance of a country from the US-led liberal court. And the level of democracy, there are also a set of control variables referring to other governance indicators, economic openness, and membership status. So this figure shows you where the operations of the bank, where the bank operates, where most of its operations are located. Interestingly, it's not only Asia anymore. They expanded to Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, and Ecuador, but also to Europe with Romania and Hungary, and also very recently to Africa with Cote d'Ivoire, Rwanda. Egypt has always been a country where they invested since the start of their operations. but there are more and more countries outside of Asia that are being selected and where the operations of the bank have been concentrated. Of course, the most of its operations are still in Asia, with India, China, and Indonesia as being the most receivers of AIIB funds. In this case, India, it's an interesting case because there have been some frictions politically between China and India. On the other hand, India tend to receive a lot of funds from the AIIB. And this is the total number of projects that were approved by the bank. So there is a correlation between the more projects are being approved for your country, the more financing you are going to end up with from the AIIB. So those are my results for the paper that I've written. They present a very different picture compared to the previous studies that I just showed you. In this case, the distance from the US-led liberal order correlates with being selected more often for receiving investments by the AIIB. So countries that are more distant from the US-led liberal order, not specifically from China, tend to receive tend to be selected more because this part relates to the selection. Countries that are less liberal in terms of their democracy also tend to receive more investments from or being selected more often from the AIIB. Regarding the governance variables, being more stable correlates to receiving more investments, which is quite intuitively and maybe one of the few intuitive results that comes out from this table, at least. While being more corrective correlates to be selected more often. Regarding the membership status, being a regional member of the bank, of course, correlates to receiving you're being selected more often and receiving more funds. We have seen before, of course, the focus is still regional. However, this second variable was really interesting to me. So being a member or having signed a memorandum of understanding in the context of the Belt and Road initiatives also correlates to being selected more often than not for receiving investments from the AIIB. And that is particularly interesting if you consider that India is not a signatory of a memorandum of understanding in the context of the Belt and Road initiative, and yet India was the main receiver of funds from the AIIB and also approved projects. Regarding the allocation, some results are similar. There are less statistically significant variables. However, being less politically stable still remains one of the main correlators with among the countries being selected for financing by the AIIB receiving more financing. So less stable countries tend to receive more financing in terms of actual USD dollars received. In terms of economical variables, being trade remains somehow statistically significant at the 10% level. But most importantly, when it comes to the distance from the US-led liberal order, again, there is the confirmation that countries that are more distant from the US-led liberal order tend to receive, not also to be selected more often than not, but also among those countries that are selected tend to receive more financing. And again, there is a confirmation that political stability correlates, a lower political stability correlates to more investments being received by the country. So in this sense, I think that those results show that there could be at least some kind of strategic foreign shopping in place, so that all those countries that would find it more difficult to find investments and receive investments from other multilateral development banks can find them more likely at the AIIB. And that the AIIB increases the complexity of the regime, and that in some cases can lead to this kind of strategies by the countries. So yeah, here are all the list of references. Also, if you want to receive the slides, I thank you for your attention. And
thank you. Thank you so much, Matteo. Well, let me sort of jump off with a first question before I open up the floor, and we've got plenty of time for questions. I suppose as I was listening to your talk and thinking a bit about also your wider PhD. And I guess that question of the social purpose of the order and thinking about, Ruggi's argument around the creation of the post-World War II international order, things like the World Bank. European states then would argue, and Ruggie would have agreed, that they were crucial in shaping that kind of embedded liberal character of the order. Given what we know about that, what would you say, I suppose, in terms of drawing together both of these papers? What role are European states still having, or that wider membership having in terms of shaping the order's social purpose? And I suppose the very presence of the AIIB itself as one of the forums among which recipient countries can now shop. What does the presence of the AIIB mean, therefore, for the kind of, I suppose, the social purpose of the development order? What are its key attributes? What are the you've got, I suppose, in some ways, opposing findings here in these two papers, and so how do you bring those two things together?
Yeah. Yes, so there are some opposing findings. I think it is really interesting that the European countries decided to join the AIIB, even though it took some negotiations. I mean, China invited both the European countries and the US and Japan at the same time. At first, the European countries didn't really want to be part of the bank, also because at first it were really only countries in Southeast Asia very close to China that had adhered to the bank. But I think that the fact that they accepted and they actually did join the bank, not all of them at the same time as it was shown before, shows that there was some interest in, at least at first, keeping that new initiative under some kind of not control, but trying to understand better what was the purpose of the bank itself. Regarding the operation, it is interesting to see that countries that are further away from the US-led liberal order can find some more investments within the AIIB. However, I mean, it is something that is similar to what is happening at the World Bank. I mean, there are like two fronts, two alliances matter a lot when it comes to financing from those multilateral development banks that should be more neutral. So it is clear that the United States didn't want a competitor or an institution that can undermine, but I think it really doesn't undermine the social purpose of the order, because it really aligns, and there is a lot of evidence of the AIIB aligning with what are the environmental and social standards nowadays, and that were already implemented by the World Bank. So I think the main difference among those two institutions is really the role that the two great powers play within the banks. On the one hand, you have the US, and on the other hand, you have China. So of course, the US wouldn't like a competitor in that field. And on the other hand, you have the European countries, which sits a little bit in the middle between those two great countries, the great powers. And of course, their positions changed a lot between 2015 and 2025 or nowadays, because in 2015 there was really this idea that Europe should have engaged more with China rather than seeing it as a strategic rival, which is the common line nowadays.
Why don't we open up the floor for questions? One thing.
Thank you, Anthony, for the fantastic presentation, and I also enjoy reading your global policy paper. I got three very quick questions and one comment. The first question is, I understand the European countries have the common understanding and commitment to the Paris Agreement. Do you see any differences between the European countries about how to engage with AIIB? The second question is, you mentioned the European countries, Australia and New Zealand. These countries actually all have a commitment to the Paris Agreement allowed to influence China. So when you do the first paper, how do you distinguish that this is influence from the European countries And there's another like influence from the non-European but also Western countries to draw your conclusion. And the third question is, you mentioned structural factors like energy crisis, the COVID. And do you see any like newly emerging structural factors like Trump administration and also the newly fueled energy crisis and also the global economic slowdown? Another comment is that for the second paper, I noticed David Landry actually that a paper is not about AIIB, but all about China's development financing and how also the quantitative analysis about how the political stability and the corruption and liberal democracy, how they might influence the China development financing that might support increase in this area. That's a fantastic presentation. Thank you.
I answer right away?
Yeah, I think
sure.
Yeah, go for it.
So differences between the European countries, there are some differences. Mainly the two main countries that differentiate a little bit between the European countries are Hungary and Poland, that especially after the energy crisis generated by Russia, by the invasion of Russia of Ukraine, they have tried to argue in favor of not so much of renewable energies, but a return to energy security and the use of fossil fuels. Hungary has always been closer to Russia, and in fact it is one of the few countries in Europe that received investments by the AIIB. So there is some differences in the way that European countries intend the energy policies that should be implemented by the AIIB. At the same time, Hungary is part of the wider European constituency, which also was was an actor as a constituency arguing in favor of an alignment with the Paris Agreement. They often argue in favor of stricter energy policies. So while there are some countries that individually have their own positions that are different from those of the other European countries, at the same time they also make group statements that go against their own vision. So it is a bit difficult to understand exactly what is their influence of those countries, and it's really only Hungary and the main country that goes against all the other. But it's not only in the case of the AIIB or in the case of energy. At the European level also, and at the European Union level also, Hungary usually goes against many of the negotiations that are being held at the European Union level. Difference between or how influential can the European countries be being opposed to New Zealand and Australia or other developed countries within the bank. While the position of the European countries has always been quite coherent and remained stable over the years, the position of other developed members of the bank, in particular Australia and New Zealand, was not always as stable. Also, probably because they do not have to negotiate with other, necessarily have to negotiate at the European level what their position might be. Another country that has swinged a little bit between this position of having stricter energy policies is South Korea, which always at times have aligned with the position of European or developed countries within the bank, but at the same time there have been certain instances, especially after, again, 2022 or after COVID, swing in the opposite position. So understanding the necessity of possibly having a more relaxed framework in the context of the energy price. And Canada also has been a supporter of those same positions. However, since 2023, I think they froze their assets within the AIIB and put on hold all of the formal relationships between Canada and the AIIB. So the group of developed allied country that push for more stricter energy policies is really becoming thinner and thinner within the AIIB. and the structural factors going ahead that can influence how the energy policies are negotiated or are implemented within the AIIB. Yeah, of course, they are going to be important, but I think that they also have been important if we think about the Trump administration and also the Trump first term, when he decided to pull back from the Paris Agreement, and then Biden reaccessed, and then Trump on the first day, I think, of its second term, pulled out again of the Paris Agreement. So in some ways, I think that the European countries, but not just them, also China, feel like there is a heavier weight on their shoulders when it comes to the negotiations at the UNCCC and related to, for example, the Paris Agreement, because of course you are missing the US, the United States, which position is a bit incoherent at this moment in time. And of course, I think that this new energy crisis that has been generated by the war on the US war on Iran and Israel on Iran is going to shape how the negotiations within not only the AIIB, but also, for example, another multilateral development bank. And there is going to be a call for, again, for possibly new, that is what we have seen during the energy crisis related to the war in Ukraine. Strangely, you would expect more focus on renewable energies and energy independence. But on the other hand, for energy security reasons, there has also been focus on going back to fossil fuels, especially by some countries. Of course, not all of them, but many developing countries have asked about going back to fossil fuels.
Thank you. Yes, we'll come here.
Really interesting paper. Just a few sort of comments and then a couple of questions. So just wondering sort of about the Paris Agreement and Paris alignment. There is a NDB joint statement on sort of Paris alignment. Was this sort of like when the AIIB was definitely first part of it? I haven't personally double checked, but was it almost a fait accompli in terms of like, did the AIIB just sort of see the writing and be like, well, we have to obviously be Paris aligned because every other bank is Paris aligned. And in order to be competitive, but also there's in the results you showed, the World Bank financing being such a large predictor on AIIB financing. It struck me as unsurprising because they do so much co-financing with the AIIB, with the AIIB and the World Bank. So it might also be interesting to sort of see, look at the quantum of financing that some of the countries receive from other NDBs. But it might not be forum shopping, it might just be that AIIB comes in at a completely different tranche. So AIIB also provides very different financing. World Bank is highly concessional, so it's AIIB, whereas AIIB, given its model, is trying to be a lot more, at least covering its cost of capital. It's trying to be leaner, it doesn't have capital increases. So that might be a reason why that's a predictor. I guess one of the things I think that might be interesting to look at, it might be a useful result in your second paper, would be to sort of think about how do the AIIB results compare when you look at the same a similar data set for the World Bank or the ADB? Do you get the same results? Do you get different results? Because I guess I get where you're coming from, but to be convinced, I'd like to see whether it's statistically different or the results are different for other multilateral development banks. Otherwise, sort of you could say similar sorts of things about the US alignment. And secondly, on stable on the stability of government, there might be a correlation there with just the fact that they are developing countries. So highly developing countries have less stable governments in the broad. So you might be picking that up, and then you might be just picking up where the AIIB is mandated to finance. And I think I heard, yes, just something that sort of had a reaction for me in my notes is upholding environmental and social standards being at odds with development. It's kind of, that's at odds with the story we're seeing coming out of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and other multilateral development banks. They're sort of seeing promoting environmental social standards, climate resilient financing as being sort of hand in hand with poverty alleviation. So it might just be, you might want to just look at.
Yeah.
There were a lot of you don't have to have.
No, all of them very interesting. I will start with the joint statement. Yeah, there has been a joint statement of many different multilateral development banks. Because if you look at them, you have the World Bank, the AIIB, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but then on the other hand, you also have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then you have the New Development Bank. So they all felt like there was this need to align with the Paris Agreement. However, in the joint statement leaves a lot of possibility for each multilateral development bank to develop in some ways its own standards and policies. So while the alignment is it's very general, I mean, we all agree to follow the principles.
There's an underlying framework which they agree to on.
Yeah, and then, for example, the AIIB has its own methodology for aligning with the Paris Agreement. So I guess that I'm not sure, but I guess that other multilateral development banks as well have their own methodology. I think the problem there is that all of these methodologies are implemented differently by each of those multilateral development banks. The common framework that you were talking about that comes out of the joint statements says exactly that it's up to each of those multilateral development banks to then develop a joint framework and develop their own policies for aligning with the Paris Agreement, which I think can fragment this system even more. So while on the
it's already pretty fragmented.
yeah, exactly. So while on the one hand, it's very good that there is an alignment of all those multilateral development banks towards the Paris Agreement. There could be still some problems related to the fact that they can all do that according to their own methodologies. Yeah, the AIIB has co-financed a lot with the World Bank, the AIIB, and also the EBRD over the years. COVID at first it was almost more than 50%. However, those figures have declined a little bit in the last years from after COVID, basically. I would argue that at first they co-financed a lot because they had to create a portfolio of investments. And also because the World Bank didn't have the same amount of resources that the AIIB had, because they were split among different projects and different regions of the world, while the AIIB had more resources to put on the table specifically for Asia. So many times the AIIB jumped on projects already negotiated or implemented by the World Bank and added more resources to the countries that were in need of those resources. Now they have been developing a portfolio of investment that is more concentrated on their own operations. So yeah, one of the predictors were more investments received by the World Bank, more likely to be selected from the AIIB. That's also probably because we're still talking about developing countries, so they all need financing. An interesting result was in the paper from Kai and their colleagues, here, the allocation. So receiving more financing from the AIIB correlates with receiving less financing from the AIIB. So in some ways, the more money you receive from one multilateral development bank, the less money you receive from the other multilateral development bank. That makes sense intuitively to me. So in some ways, while those are also contrasting results. So on the one hand, the more money you receive from the World Bank, the more likely you are to be selected. On the other hand, of course, there is also the possibility that the more money you receive from one MDB, the less you can receive from others. Other MDB's results, so of course, it would have been very, very interesting to analyze all of the previous studies regarding the World Bank, the AIIB and the informal influence of the US within those organizations. Christopher Kilby does a really nice work on those historical figures as well, because in the case of the World Bank, you really can analyze a lot of projects from the 1960s, I think they do, up until 2006 or 2012, where the study happens. And yeah, basically they use probably the same kind of variables that Kaya uses and that I also use. And yeah, it is interesting because the results are completely opposed. I mean, there is the more you align with the US liberal order and therefore with the US in some ways, the more likely you are to be selected, and also the more investments you are going to receive. Of course, we are talking about a different period of analysis. So we are talking also of a period that takes into consideration the Cold War. But that is what the results related to the World Bank and the AIIB suggest. And it is interesting to see that those results are reversed in the case of the AIIB.
Yeah, I guess just as a suggestion, it would be interesting if you take the same subset of countries you've got for the AIIB, and take the project of the World Bank and the AIIB have done there, and see if you can get the same result or different results. It would just be an interesting comparison. Just there.
Thank you.
Very interesting presentation, and to add on to the gentleman's comment there, my question goes to intentionality. I know it's very difficult when you're looking at correlated data to I mean, by definition, it's correlation, so not necessarily causation, but the degree to which you see this behavior, as we say, this strategic behavior being intentional or being symptomatic of something else, that's another person mentioned. And also the issue of co-financing is interesting. Is it useful, given that you mentioned there, Matteo, the shifts like in recent years post-COVID towards away from doing co-financing? Was your analysis, did your analysis cater to like also those projects that were non-co-financed, to see if there was perhaps a different behavior when the AIIB was acting with its own volition, so to say? And then taking your paper, and I think it was Kaya and Cameron and some of the earlier works that were done by others in this field, is one to draw that you know, by necessarily distancing oneself from the US sort of liberal world order doesn't necessarily mean being closer to, you know, on the other end, like a China-led order. It's sort of like it could be, but it could also be something else. You know, what's your kind of?
Well, the results suggest it wasn't. Well, they're inconsistent. Right. So there's a further work to be done.
Yeah, exactly. For sure, there is further work to be done. Also, because if we consider China and well, its measurement when it comes to the voting behavior at the UNGA, China sits a little bit in the middle. So not really on the one end of the spectrum, nor on the other hand. So measuring the distance of a country from China literally means measuring the distance of a country from the middle of the distribution. Mm-hmm. So I thought that in the case of Kaya, it doesn't really, it's not super efficient, because you do not only measure countries that are less aligned with China, but you also in a negative way of the distribution, so to say, but also you measure countries that are more distant from China in the other direction, so that are more aligned with the US-led liberal order. So I think that there is some more work to be done there, because I think there is never a perfect variable. You never find a perfect variable. But yeah, how to operationalize that specific variable, it's really the key to understanding how the AIIB operates. Because in the case of Kaya, for example, you could have a country that is super aligned with the US-led liberal order and very distant to China, or a country that is super further away from the US-led liberal order and very distant to China as well. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really work in a way, I think. intentionality, of course, it's very difficult to assess. I think the control variables that both Kaya and her colleagues and I use in some way try to control for that, because you can see that both population, GDP per capita, and they use these how many roads are for the area of the country. So they try to control for the need of a country for infrastructure investments. So yeah, of course, it's really difficult to assess the intentionality. I think you could argue qualitatively that countries that seem at least to be more aligned with China tend to receive more financing by looking at the map. And looking at the map was also one of the reasons that led me to think about trying to do this study or trying to update the study of Kaya, because you can see that there are some countries that tend also, like just by looking at it, tend to receive more financing. However, yeah, we are still talking about developing countries. All of them really need all of those investments. Yeah, trying to select and take out only the not co-finance projects is something really interesting. However, maybe there aren't yet enough not co-finance projects, or yeah, of course there are not co-finance projects, but doing a statistical analysis on those will be a little bit too early, maybe, because there aren't so many yet.
And just as the other gentleman mentioned, maybe a reference point, a helpful control point being sort of where the ADB World Bank rate on the same analysis. On the flip side, I'm picking now from your presentation, actually, I mean, China has their own policy banks, right? Like, China Development Bank, for example. I don't know if that data is publicly available, maybe not, but if it is publicly available, that would also could also be an interesting reference point as another anchor to your analysis.
Yeah, for sure. I think, well, in some ways, I included the trade with China as a variable, trying to also take that into consideration. And Kai and their colleagues also use the amount of foreign direct investments that a country receives, both from all the other countries and from China specifically. Those measures were not statistically significant. So I don't know how much there could be there. But of course, it's interesting. It will be interesting to include something like that. Yeah.
Just a question about the board members. Can you please go back to the slide? Do we know the mechanism of would be the mother country of the board member? If it was a group of countries.
Yeah.
So
like here?
Say, yeah, or the one before. So let's say number 8. So the board member would be from Poland or the UK, or do we know the mechanism of the rotating of countries?
Yeah, I think in the case of Constituency 9, from some interviews that I've done, there is the expectation that there are 3 main countries rotating, that are Italy, Germany, and France. Because it also really depends on how many resources a country can, also human resources, a country can employ specifically at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So there are many multilateral development banks that each country. So if I think about Italy, France, and Germany, for example, they are members of the AIIB, the AIIB, the World Bank, the BRD. So you really need a lot of human resources to cover all of those banks at the same time, the negotiations taking place at all of those banks at the same time. So they take turns in electing the director. I think at the moment the director is should be from Germany, and with Italy and France as alternates. At the same time, Constituency 8, I think for most of its time is being elects a director that comes from the United Kingdom. At the moment is a director from the UK, and then all the other countries elects alternates. And I think that works for all the countries within a constituency, because you have to split a lot of resources among different multilateral development banks. So even, for example, Italy, France, or Germany at times do not have the resources to really cover all of those banks at the same time. So it is, on the one hand, of course, it is a privilege and an advantage to elect your own director at the board of directors. On the other hand, it's also something that takes away a lot of resources from a country. So yeah, they try to alternate as much as possible. They try to rotate as much as possible in terms of who is elected as a director, but at the same time they also coordinate internally. So while there is a director that is from one of those countries, at least in the case of the European countries, they have already coordinated at the European level, and they do the same thing. For example, at the World Bank, the European Union members are grouped into one or two constituencies. They elect one director for all of the whole constituency, but they at the same time they already negotiate internally what is their position.
And these countries by default would be with the highest percentage of power, or not necessarily?
So when they try to group the constituency, I think in any multilateral development bank, they try to be as fair as possible. So given the fact that there are 12 constituencies, they try to split the voting power equally among those different constituencies. In fact, as you can see here, for example, China has 25% of the total voting power. So they have more voting power within the board of governors than they would have within the board of directors, because there are 12 different constituencies and they can only elect one of the 12 directors. In the case of Europe or constituencies related to non-regional members, among the 12 directors or the 12 constituencies, there are only 3 or 4 that are related to non-regional members. So while in this case European countries are grouped quite coherently, there are some other cases where you have African countries with Latin American countries, because to have some kind of balance in the total voting power within one constituency, you have to group countries that are very different among them. There is a little bit more coherence when it comes to the regional members. So constituencies that are formed only for regional members, and that is also because there is more space to work, let's say, because the AIIB has a norm that says that 75% of the total voting power needs to remain within regional members, while only 25% of the voting power can be delegated or give to non-regional members, which is something that happens similarly at the Asian Development Bank. So for regional development banks, it is something common to have more resources also officially structured for regional members.
Yeah, I have a second question that might be heavy. Are the Europeans or Australia posting currently any concern over the influence of China over countries they lend money to or invest their infrastructure in?
Not at the AIIB. So it's not a theme that emerges within the negotiation of the AIIB. The topic of how China operates bilaterally. Or, for example, it's not a topic while China often cites the Belt and Road Initiative, saying that that the AIIB and the Belt and Road Initiative should work together to to improve the system. The European countries almost never mention the Belt and Road Initiatives or how China operates bilaterally.
They're not concerned about the influence of China over countries they invest their infrastructure in?
They are for sure, but not in the context of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Let's say I don't think they see the AIIB as the place where they can contest how China operates bilaterally.
Oh, thank you.
You're brilliant.
I'm from the law school. It's actually related to this, because when you look at the board of directors, came to me immediately as someone from the corporate world is that, well, the directors probably doesn't matter. What matters more is their agenda setting power, which lands with the executives. how these projects are actually filtered within AIIB first, and what kind of input that they may get from these board of directors or member countries informally before they actually put together a list and then present it for voting by the director. I think that stage probably still remains like a black box, but it's probably very, very critical in understanding how this influence has been passed. And there could be maybe some proximities to that. So, for example, if you look at, because the bank also provides funding for projects within China. So every year, the NRDC and MOF would issue circulars about the guidance about how to apply for projects funding from this bank. So maybe there could be some parallel, or maybe they're set completely with domestic parameters. I don't know. Maybe that's one area to look at, right? And in relating to that is the point you mentioned is very interesting. You put relating to this gentleman's point about sustainability versus development. But I think domestically, China probably joined these two together through industry policies. So I was wondering whether there could be maybe measures on how that is duplicated to probably add to the disbursement or selection of projects within the bank.
Thanks. So yeah, the role of the board of directors and each director votes. I think it is still something relevant. They still do have. They still vote on most of the projects that are approved by the bank. It used to be that the board of directors voted on all of the projects approved by the bank. Then I think in 2019 or 2020, it was approved the accountability framework within the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which gives more power to the president and the management. So it is true in for some cases that the president and the senior management can take decisions on the approval of projects without the explicit consent of the directors. It's some very specific cases. It needs to be projects that are approved for regional members. It needs to be projects that do not pose substantial environmental and social problems, or that are not that do not have a high impact on those sectors. The main reason why that was implemented, and probably it was not very criticized by the European countries or the directors in general, it's because it's a way to speed up the process of the approval of projects. So the creation of the AIIB and the NDB in some ways was decided explicitly because the World Bank and the AIIB systems were too slow. So one of the main reasons that those banks were set up was to speed up the process. And that is a way to speed up the process that, of course, takes away a little bit of power from the hands of the director and places it in the hands of the president and the senior management. So there needs to be a balance there. If you want to speed up the process, in some ways you have to take away a little bit of power. Of course, there are only very specific cases where that can happen. Domestic parameters. The AIIB leaves the possibility open for using country system or country parameters. However, only in very specific cases. The norms that are implemented by the AIIB are almost always negotiated at the AIIB level and are applied for all of the projects, so that no country can adopt specific norms or standards to be applied to the projects approved and implemented in a specific country. That is very different, for example, to what we can see in the case of the New Development Bank, which is another bank that I look at more broadly in my PhD thesis. So if you look at the New Development Bank, the policy is to always use the country system. So for each of the projects, there isn't really there is a framework, very broad, but then when it comes to the standards applied to the projects, it is up to each country to adopt their own standards in the projects of the new development bank. So in a way, the AIIB aligns more closely to what is, for example, the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank when it comes to the norms applied to the projects approved. Also, while at first the AIIB assured that they wouldn't use conditionalities as much as they were being used at the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, they have approved in their latest energy sector strategy, I think, the possibility of having projects that are climate-based policy financing, I think is the name. So they attach climate-based conditionalities to their projects. So that is also something that is happening at the AIIB, and that makes it align more closely with other multilateral development banks, and that is not happening, for example, at the New Development Bank, which is in clear contrast with conditionalities. And the question of sustainability and development, it's very interesting. However, I think it's a bit broader than the context of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The principle of sustainable development is something that has been negotiated not only in the context of the AIIB, but of the Paris Agreement, for example, at any UNCCC, at any COP, they talk about the principle of sustainable development. And of course, again, you have to take into consideration the necessities both of developed and developing countries. So it's really difficult to strike a balance between sustainability and development. And I think not only the AIIB, but also in other settings, we still not have a really clear definition of what sustainable development is meant to be.
I'm afraid we're at time. But Matteo, can I just say thank you so much? It's really fine-grained analysis, and your knowledge of not only the AIIB but also how it contrasts to others, the NDB and others, is really helpful, I think, in situating it within our broader understanding of how this landscape is evolving and how NDBs, China, other countries within these institutions are engaging with China is incredibly helpful. So thank you. We hope to see the second paper out in the world soon. So please do keep in touch with us, and we can share it to those who were here today.